Greetings, this is Management 430, and this module competency is on performance management, which is basically how do we work with individual employees to manage their performance. This is a little bit different than talent management because talent management was about the different ways that we have to consider the ways we treat our employees. So how do we handle unionized workers versus international workers and those sorts of things. Now what we're looking at is the individual employee and how do I help them to create a context of motivation, right? How do I make sure they're getting paid fairly and that they have good performance appraisals and they get feedback accordingly and that we keep them safe? These are important issues, regardless of whether it's unionized or international. These are relevant issues for our employees. So we will talk in this particular set of lectures on pay structure, which is how we set up base pay, how we determine who should get paid what, and what kind of job category gets paid what amount of money. And we'll get into that in a few moments. So when we think of pay as a reward, it's what we do in exchange for our work, for the work of the employee. And everything always comes out to be an exchange, right? Because it's a contract. I expect you to do certain work, and you expect me to pay you for that work, and you expect it to be paid fairly. And so we've talked a little bit about motivation theories and pay as a reward and what that means. And we'll get into one other additional theory just as a refresher on equity theory. But overall, what we're looking at here is pay and the pay system, how it impacts motivation and retention and things like that. So when we talk about compensation, we're actually talking about a thing called total compensation. And total compensation includes base pay, pay for performance, and then benefits, as well as recognition systems, which are more intrinsic motivators, and status and title. All of that is also an intrinsic. It could be an extrinsic motivator and an intrinsic motivator, but it's a balance between the two, right? So we want to make sure we have a really clear total compensation package where people know the total compensation that they will get, which includes all different monetary rewards that they get. They get a base pay, they get a pay for performance like a bonus or a merit pay increase. They might get a cost of living increase, and then they also get benefits, which cost the company money. And sometimes there's some cost sharing there, which we'll get into, but by and large, the company pays for most benefits. We also know that when workers are unhappy with pay, they are very likely to leave. This is a fundamental thing that needs to be there. They have to be paid fairly. And then we can work on the intrinsic motivators, the things that get them excited about coming to work and helping them to feel challenged, like having autonomy and mastery and purpose. So a reward system, or a total compensation package, and our reward system is about the policies and procedures that we use to determine who gets paid what, and how we determine pay for performance. So how do we reward people for differences in performance? And obviously the returns that employees get for doing work, this is part of that exchange, that contractual exchange. I expect them to do work, and then they expect to get paid for that work with a fair pay, benefits, and recognition and things like that. When we have really lousy systems, when we have poor performance appraisals, when we have unfairness within our compensation system, if we don't have transparency, this creates more problems. And what it ends up with is two basic categories. We have relational returns, and then we have total compensation. And so our reward system can be both financial and non-financial rewards. It's not just pay. We can design jobs in such a way that are enriched so people feel like they have good non-financial rewards, good opportunities for learning, job security, and things like that. So the relational returns or the relational rewards are the non-monetary rewards, the incentives, the thank yous, the kudos, the opportunities for development, knowing that you've got a solid job and you don't have to worry about losing it, getting recognition overall. These are really important relational rewards that people need. And I say this often to people, don't assume that you never have to thank your employees for doing their job, because you do. They don't have to stay here. They can go somewhere else. So if you like them and you appreciate the work that they're doing, then it's okay to say, thanks for the efforts you put into that. You did a great job, and well done, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the things that we want to be thinking about. The other aspect of the reward system is the compensation stuff, as we talked about. It is our base pay, it is our pay for performance, and that's what we call variable pay, because the variable pay will change based on your performance. And its benefits like insurance and retirement plans and work-life things like making sure you've got a therapist to go to and making sure you've got a wellness program or a gym membership, those sorts of things. One of the most important issues, if you remember from our discussion of the expanded expectancy model, was that people needed to be paid fairly. And so equity in the decisions that we make, how those rewards are meted out, all have to do with what is considered to be fair. And all decisions, obviously, in the organization should be fair. But remember, fairness is really in the eyes of the beholder. What I consider to be fair is different than what you consider to be fair. So it's important that we figure out what our employees collectively believe is appropriate, checking in with them and getting a sense of what they think is or isn't fair. And then we will make our pay decisions based on the best effort we can make to be fair, because you're never going to please everybody. You have to just do the best you can to make sure you are as fair as you can be. And equity theory is one way that we think about that. Remember, I said equity theory is about comparison of my work and my efforts, and then others' works and others' efforts. And how do I determine, the in and out of the efforts versus your in and out of efforts, and how it goes from there. The other thing that's also foundational to equity theory is this notion of justice theories, and there's different ways that we can feel and determine if something feels just or fair, and we'll get into that in a few seconds here. So equity theory is influenced by comparisons and referent to others, and it's the ratio of my rewards to my efforts. And when the reward to effort ratio is solid compared to me in the past, a coworker, my boss, whatever, the ratio needs to be the same. I expect somebody who has a more important job than me will make proportionately more money than me, but it shouldn't be disproportionate. And I think it's the perception of what is proportionate that differs from everybody. Everybody's threshold is a little bit different. And we want to make sure it is fair compared to whatever the referent group is. As I said, whether it's me in the past, my coworker who does the same work as me, or the future, what I want to do in the future, or what my boss does, or what my colleague at another organization does. So we have a whole host of reference. And when we feel like that's out of whack, that's when we work hard to fix what we think is the inequity. So how do they resolve the inequity, the feelings of inequity? Well, first of all, managers should help employees to start to understand what is the appropriate frame. For example, who are they referring to? Are they referring to somebody who they think is doing less work than them, or perhaps doing more work than them? We want to make sure we're making it in an important comparison, to understand why we feel something is unfair or inequitable. So obviously we need to make sure we're comparing ourselves to an appropriate entity. Then we have to make sure we have factual information. And it might be that you think somebody is not working hard, but in fact they are. You're just not seeing all of it. Remember, we don't see every aspect of somebody else's life, so we don't know what they're always doing. Or we might think we're doing a better job than we really are, and therein lies some of the problems, right? If we don't have factual information and we're making assumptions, that's also going to impact the perceptions of inequity. And then we can restore equity. We can quit the job. We can decide that we want to, ask for a raise. Whatever it will do to help restore the equity. And so it could be that I just need to work harder in order to get more money. Or it could be that I'm working hard enough and I'm not getting paid appropriately. There's a whole host of facts involved. And so, again, there's all sorts of machinations that we can go through to determine how we make a decision about what is fair or not fair. Similar to equity theory, we have what we call justice theories. And justice theories really stem from what is considered equitable or fair, right? And it is focused on how we perceive what is fair. And we perceive it based on what we call distributive, procedural, or interactive justice. So what are each of those elements mean? Distributive is how we distribute the outcome. Is the outcome fair? So let's say two people applied for the job. I think that I'm a better candidate, and yet I see somebody who I think is a poorer candidate get the job over me. Now, there are a whole host of things that could be going on here, right? It could be that the outcome was perfectly fair because we didn't really know the full scope of what they did versus what I did and why they're getting more or less money than I am, or they are more likely to get the job than I will. So I'm looking at how fair the distribution of outcomes is, and if the distribution of outcomes is consistent, it's proportional, it follows the ratio, then it should be fine. But often it's not, where I see somebody getting a reward for things that they did not do or they didn't do well, but I don't get a reward for similar activities. And a great example is I asked my company a number of years ago if they would be willing to train me on how to do an operational budget, and what that looks like and how should I better manage it. And I said, I would like you to train me on how to do this. And they said, well, we don't pay for training. And I said, but I pay the bills, and I know you pay for training. I've seen you pay for somebody's conversational French class, and I've seen you pay for somebody's CPA prep class. Explain to me why you won't pay for mine, but you'll pay for theirs. And they said, well, we know that you see things that other people don't, but our policy is we don't pay for training. That was an unfair outcome because there was no given reason, no good reason why they would pay for some trainings, but not for my training. So given that, I decided not to stay in the organization, and I eventually left. So the distribution of the outcomes, it could be unfair, or it could be just a perception that it's unfair, and in fact, it was more fair than we thought it was. But that requires more factual information for us to be able to make that determination. Then we have procedural justice, which is how the process is managed. It's not just the outcome, right? But it's how we manage the process, the decisions that we make along the way. And let's say we have two job candidates. One I bring in and I take them out to lunch, and the other candidate, and we don't really talk about much, just lots of fun things. And the other candidate comes in and they have to go through all these rigorous tests, and I see this, right? And I see that one candidate is being treated differently than another candidate, but my boss wants to hire the candidate that they just had a casual conversation with, and they didn't get all the rigorous testings. The process was unfair. Not only is the outcome unfair, but the process for determining the outcome is considered unfair. So when people are thinking about what is fair or what is just, they look at the reward or they look at the outcome. that they are getting. Then they also look at the process. Was the process to determine the outcome considered fair? And then lastly, interactional. Were people treated with consideration, treated fairly interpersonally? Were they respected? Were they given dignity? And were they treated kindly? And if I walk in and you don't treat me with kindness or dignity, I will think that's unfair. And so interpersonally, I don't believe you gave me a chance, and therefore interpersonally, you would not be interested in, I would not be interested in continuing to work for a company that doesn't treat me fairly or kindly. So it's also important when we see differences in interpersonal treatment. One person gets treated really well, another person gets treated very indifferently. And why is that? And it could be for a whole host of reasons. Often because of bias, conscious or unconscious, but nonetheless, interactional justice or differences in interpersonal treatment also relevant.